Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Demai, Chapter 4, Halacha 1 in the Art Scroll 33a1. We learned earlier that, especially during the week, if you go and you ask an Am Haaretz for their testimony and say, oh, was this tithed? That you can't rely on it. They're not trustworthy, and their testimony that they give is not worth anything. Part of why that is not necessarily because the Am Haaretz is a bad guy. Might not be a bad person, might be a very nice guy. But the point is that the tithes themselves are complicated, and these people are not learning. And so they're not going to necessarily know how to calculate each of the tithes. They're not going to know, maybe they won't know the order of the tithes. Maybe they won't know how much to take out. And then you also have this whole thing of apathy. Some of the people might not be fervent enough to do the tithes as well. We know that there was a debate between Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Hoshaya earlier in Demai about what is the extent of the tithes. Rabbi Hoshaya was saying that the majority of the Am Haaretzim are going to do most of the tithes because there is an awe for the tithes. And Rabbi Yochanan was the opinion that they're only going to do Truma Gedola. Now that's important because that means that we're not dealing with definite tevel. And all of the laws, or suspect tevel, all of the laws would look a lot different in Demai if we were dealing with cases of suspect tevel. We learned that in Chapter 1, Halacha 1 with Rabbi Yossi. It's one of the first sugyas here in the whole Gemara, that we're not dealing in Demai with suspect tevel. These laws would not be that case if it was suspect tevel. These are cases where the Am Haaretz might have done the tithes, and certainly Truma Gedola is going to be taken out. The case that we're getting into today is going to be an exception where you can trust the Am Haaretz. There's a leniency that the rabbis put in here about Shabbat. And it's going to come up with Rabbi Yochanan that the reason that you can trust an Am Haaretz if you're asking them, was this tithed, and you can get their testimony on Shabbat, is because the biblical obligation of Oneg Shabbos is a positive commandment that is a Doraita commandment, and Demai is going to be a D'Rabbanan commandment. And we know that something that's Doraita, that's a Ta'aseh, is going to override a D'Rabbanan lo Ta'aseh. Anyway, we're going to get more into that. The Mishnah is very interesting. This is going to be a three-part shiur. This is part one of the shiur. So the Mishnah starts off, it says, if someone purchases produce from someone who is not trusted regarding tithes, in other words, he's buying the produce from the Am Haaretz, who is suspect of not adhering to the tithing obligations, and the produce is going to be Demai. The Mishnah continues and says, and the purchaser forgot to tithe the produce before Shabbat. He may ask the seller on the Shabbos whether he tithed it, and he may then eat the produce based on his word. That's a big Hiddush, and without Chapter 4, Halacha 1, without this Mishnah, we wouldn't know this law. We would assume that on Shabbat, this would be just like asking on a Yom Shlishi, on a the third day of the week. You're asking Am Haaretz, you can't trust them. Their word doesn't mean anything for tithes. Also, their word doesn't mean anything for something that's Tamei or Tahor. They don't know how to do it. So one of the cases over here is that you're not allowed to tithe on Shabbat. That's going to be whether you have definite tevel or you have suspect tevel or you have Demai. You're not allowed to separate out tithes during Shabbos. Why? Because you start to fall into the malachot of Beur. You're starting to make separations and sorting. And so even if the designation that you're making wouldn't hold, it's not a real tithe, you've still designated it and sorted it. You sorted it as this is a tithe and this is not. So you have a Beur problem. You also have a problem where you're separating good from bad. That's another another issue. So you have a lot of sorting issues that would happen. You're not allowed to tithe on Demai. So we also learned that this is in Berachot chapter 1, Halacha 1, that when there's 2 stars in the sky before Shabbat, that's a very special time, and it's not 3 stars in the sky, so it's not definite Shabbat, and you're dealing with like it's maybe Shabbat. It's a suffix. So over there, you're still allowed to tithe Demai, but you're not allowed to tithe definite tevel, because that's a Doraita thing versus Darabanan again. And over here, we're also going to be getting into what happens at the end of Shabbat. Now, we know that in this case, although the Amma Aretz is generally not believed, and certainly during the week, he's not believed when he says that the produce is tithed. In this case, the rabbis are giving a leniency, and they're going to allow the buyer of this produce to rely on the seller's testimony. We're going to get more about that into the Gemara. Now, the Mishnah is going to continue, and it's going to say, however, on the onset of darkness at the departure of Shabbat, with the onset of darkness at the departure of Shabbat, he may not eat the remaining produce until he separates tithes. So when Shabbat is coming in, he can ask for this testimony. But this leniency only exists on Shabbat. And by the way, we're going to see also in part 2 of the shiur on Yom Tov and Shabbat when they're together. But this leniency is basically only in a case literally just before Shabbat. And there's a Tosefta that talks about that. Like, if you had time during the week to tithe this produce, let's say you bought from an Amma Aretz a basket of pomegranates. We'll just use the basket of pomegranates for the shiur as an example, because it's going to come up again. And you have this basket, and you didn't have time during the week to tithe it. You forgot. You were busy, and you forgot. And let's say you find the seller literally an hour before. Are you allowed to rely on his word that it's tithed or not? You are going to be allowed that leniency, and certainly during Shabbat. But what this Mishnah is saying is this leniency does not carry over after Shabbat into the normal week. This is only just for you to have oneg Shabbat, and it does not clear you of any tithing obligation, and his word goes into the rest of the week, and it can't be trusted again. Again, the mechanism of how this is working is oneg Shabbat is Doraita, and this is Darabanan. So when Shabbat departs, that Doraita reason that you have for this leniency goes away. You have to tithe it. So the Mishnah continues and says, if he did not find the seller on Shabbat, and he's not able to ask him, but someone else who is also not trusted regarding tithes says to him on Shabbat that this produce is tithed, he may eat it based on his word. Now, what is this leniency talking about? Let's say my friend David over here is the seller of these pomegranates, and his neighbor Shmuel knows David very well, and you saw Shmuel, but you can't find David. And you ask Shmuel, did David tithe these or not? Does he tithe or not? Generally, what this is assuming is that the Amoratzim are going to be honest among each other. In other words, they're going to say like, oh yeah, he tithed, and he's if he's not like if he's a guy who doesn't tithe, he's not going to lie about it. And if David in this example doesn't tithe, Shmuel is going to be honest about it and say, oh yeah, like David doesn't tithe, he can't rely on that. So it's generally going to believe that there's like a code among other Amoratzim that they're going to look at each other in a certain way. But what this is also saying is that, again, this permit is only during Shabbat, and once Shabbat goes away, this permit from this second person testifying on the other Am Haaretz, this is also going to go away. Again, what's going to be coming up in this Gemara is they're really just looking for a reason to allow this leniency, and this is going to be part of this. So Mishnah continues and says, with the onset of the darkness at the departure of the Shabbos, he may not eat the remaining produce until he tithes them. He has to separate tithes. So the Mishnah is teaching that even another Am Haaretz who has nothing to gain by lying can be relied upon only with regard to produce eaten during Shabbat. And once the Shabbos ends, the produce has to be tithed like any other Demai. And the Rambam is ruling that an Am Haaretz can always be relied upon to testify that someone else's produce is tithed. This, by the way, is coming up in Mishnah Torah, Hilchos Meiser 12:17 by the Rambam, and that seems to be a little bit inconsistent with this Mishnah, where it's saying that an Am Haaretz is relied upon only during the Shabbos consumption, and some are going to answer, like the Ravad, by the way, are going to answer that although an Am Haaretz can usually be relied upon regarding another's produce, in the case of the Mishnah, there are more reasons for concern, since the Am Haaretz is going to tend to trust their fellow Am Haaretz on tithes. We're worried that an Am Haaretz might testify that he knows for a fact that the produce has been tithed, while the only basis for the testimony is a belief that his fellow Am Haaretz would never sell produce without tithing it. And therefore, we're not going to accept the basis of this testimony based on that. Now, we're going to get into more reasons why an Am Haaretz would be afraid to lie on Shabbat, and that's going to be coming up as well. We're going to get into another case in the Mishnah. It's going to say, regarding Trumos Meiser, separated from produce of Demai, that subsequently returned to its place. So what does that mean? That means that you have a pile of pomegranates, and I have my basket of Demai pomegranates, and I was separating Demai out, and I separated out Trumos Meiser, and now it fell into this general hulin of pomegranates. Now what? And what do? There's a lot of issues here, because Truma Gedola of Demai that gets mixed with hulin, you're not required to separate Truma Gedola from Demai. Why? Because the Am Haaretz is presumed to have already separated that. We're talking about Trumas Meiser that would be after Meiser Rishon, so we're talking about probably like Meiser Sheni. So the question is, now with Meiser Sheni that falls in, what do? That gets to be complicated, and we'll cover that in detail in the Gemara. But generally, after the purchaser separates Trumas Meiser from Demai, that's brought from, he purchased it from the Am Haaretz, and this Truma Meiser falls back into the remaining produce of Hulin. As a law for Truma Gedola, the Truma Meiser does not become nullified in a mixture unless that mixture has 100 permitted parts. That's 1 in 100. And then the 101st one will be nullified. So in this mixture, it's going to be prohibited to a non-Kohanim as Meduma. That's a mixture of Truma and Hulin. And the only way to permit this kind of mixture, and we're going to get more about that into detail, for non-Kohen to use it, is by trying to figure out if the Demai produce had originally been tithed by the Am Haaretz or not. And then what would happen is, based on this designation of Trumas Meiser, if it would be extra, then it would be invalid. So there's a lot going on here. We'll cover that. Now, interesting end to this Mishnah. Rabbi Shimon HaShazuri says, even during the week, one may ask the seller whether the produce he sold him was tithed, and he may eat the produce based on his word. So, although an Am Haaretz is generally not believed on a weekday, what this allowance is by Rabbi Shimon HaShutzuri is saying is that the rabbis are lenient about this, and they're going to allow the buyer to rely on the seller's testimony that the produce was tithed, in which case the truma meiser that the purchaser separated is not really trumas meiser, and it doesn't render the produce into which it gets mixed a meduma. That's the mechanism that he's relying on. And the Rambam about this in his commentary in the Mishnah is going to explain and understand the end of this Mishnah by Rabbi Shimon HaShutzuri as referring to trumas meiser that gets mixed with regular produce while in the possession of the seller, and the seller was observed separating trumas meiser when it falls back into the produce from which it was separated, and that would render the produce forbidden to a non-Kohen. And this Mishnah is teaching that if the seller claims that he already tithed the mixture, it would make it permissible again, and he'd be believed, and then the Kohen can eat the produce. That's the commentary by the Rambam. Very important to read the Mishnah's commentaries by the Rambam. So the Gemara is going to move on, and it's going to explain why we're going to rely on the testimony of the Am Haaretz on Shabbat, where this leniency is coming from. So the Gemara says that the colleagues in the study hall said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, it is on account of the honor of the Shabbos that the rabbis permitted relying on what is normally worthless testimony from the Am Haaretz regarding tithes. Again, an Am Haaretz is not trusted on testimony for tithes or tahoros. Their testimony is worth nothing. Why? Because they don't know how to do it. First of all, they might be very lax on it, but second of all, they don't have the technical know-how in order to do it. So it's these laws are complicated. They're necessary, but they're complicated, and so they don't learn them. And so if they're making a testimony on it, it doesn't mean very much during the weekday. So the Gemara is going to try to dig in and understand why is it like this. The Gemara says if it's only on account of the honor of Shabbos that the rabbis permitted eating the produce and the testimony of the Am Haaretz is going to be worthless, then why is it necessary to ask the Am Haaretz at all? So the Gemara is going to answer, and it's going to say that we wished to permit them with a pretext. So the rabbis did not want to make it obvious to everyone that they were waiving the Demai prohibition just for the honor of Shabbos. They wanted to keep some kind of awe for tithes in there, and that's why they're going to make this pretext. So, and this by the way is coming from Rabbi Yochanan. So they're requiring that the Am Haaretz gives testimony that it is tithe, so that it would appear as if we have something to rely on. But the reality is, the truth is that this is really just a pretext. And really the Am Haaretz's testimony really doesn't have any validity here. That's going to be the insight by the Vilna Goan in Shari Amuna. Now, the Rosh is going to have an interesting insight about this. The Rosh is going to say that there's a certain benefit from questioning an Am Haaretz. This is a very keen insight by the Rosh. He's going to say, although an Am Haaretz can't be relied upon to testify that the produce is tithe, if he answers that the produce was not tithe, he's surely going to be believed. And this would help to prevent forbidden consumption of tevel. We know that eating tevel is very serious. So you might have Am Haaretz who knows what tevel is, and he might actually testify, no, this wasn't tithe, you can't eat that. So that's a big hiddush by the Rosh. There's a completely different answer for why this leniency exists, and why you can rely on the testimony of the Am Haaretz, but this is going to get challenged. And really, we're going to look at Rabbi Yochanan as the real reason. Why? Because it's owning Shabbos. That's really the reason. And that's a D'oraita obligation, and Demai is going to be D'Rabbanan. And we're looking for a pretext and like that. Here's the other explanation. Here's the other reason given. Rabbi Bivi says in the name of Rabbi Hanina, the awe of Shabbat is upon him. That's going to be the Am Haaretz, and he's going to say the truth. In other words, the Am Haaretz, says the Rambam commentary in Hilchos Meiser 12:1, is going to say that the Am Haaretz is in awe of the holiness of Shabbat, and they're afraid to transgress the day. And they will not tell a lie on the Shabbos, and their testimony on the Shabbos that the produce is tithe is going to be given credence. So the Rambam is going to be understanding this as something where there can be a little bit of weight here, because they're not going to want you they're going to get confused about some of the laws of Shabbat. And there's a couple of reasons why. One is they're gonna be afraid to lie on Shabbat. One of the other reasons is going to be that normally you're allowed to snack on untithed produce during the week. But on Shabbat, when everybody knows that you're not allowed to make separations, they're going to be afraid that you might eat this untithed produce, and they might actually tell you the truth on it. That's the other reason why he's going to say the truth. So the Gemara is going to ask, and it's going to say, but if the awe of Shabbat is upon him, and we assume that he's being truthful when the produce is tithe, how is it that in this circumstance we learn in the Mishnah that with the onset of darkness at the departure of Shabbat, he may not eat the remaining produce until he separates tithes? And that's a very good reason. In other words, if you're going to believe him that on Shabbat his testimony has extra believability, then you would say, well, okay, now I have these pomegranates from, Shabbat. Now it's, Yom Rishon. And why can't I just use his testimony on Yom Rishon, the day after Shabbat, and go eat the pomegranates? Mishnah says you can't. It goes back to being untrustworthy. And again, that's really going to be a case that it's going to look more like Rabbi Yochanan's case, that really the testimony is just a pretext, and really, we have this case of the Oneg Shabbat overriding this D'Rabbanan lo ta'aseh. So we're going to have an answer to this, and then there's going to be a challenge, and it's going to look like a pretty serious challenge. So the answer to this is going to be that one may not continue to rely on the testimony of the Am Haaretz after Shabbat is ended on account of the Am Haaretz, the one Am Haaretz upon whom there's no awe of Shabbat. So this really splits the Am Haaretzim into two categories. You have the Am Haaretzim who are going to respect Shabbat and respect Judaism and Torah, and then you have the Am Haaretz who, while still unlearned, is really like an Erev Rav, and he's really like the kind of guy who, really doesn't keep Shabbat, doesn't respect Shabbat, and you see these kinds of guys all the time. So the guy's still unlearned, and he doesn't have the wisdom, and then he also doesn't keep Torah. And so it splits it into two. And so Am Haaretzim are generally not going to be suspected to lie on Shabbat at this time that this Gemara is written, but there's still a minority of Am Haaretzes who are still going to lie even on Shabbat. And the rabbis, according to this opinion by Rabbi Bivi, are going to be reluctant to rely on the Shabbos testimony of the Am Haaretz, except on Shabbat itself, when tithing is going to be prohibited. But once Shabbat ends and the purchaser has the ability to make tithes, he has to make tithes, and he can't rely on the testimony anymore. And that's also going to be, with like what the explanation of the Vilna Goan is going to be like. So really, you can look at this like Rabbi Bivi's holding that the rabbis are permitting relying on the Shabbos testimony of the Am Haaretz when you're not able to do the tithes. But when you are able to do the tithes, you have to go ahead and tithe. The Gemara is going to challenge this, and it's going to say, it was taught in the Baraisa, that if the purchaser asked the Am Haaretz on a weekday, and he responded that the produce is tithed, he may not rely on his testimony and eat the produce on the Shabbos. And according to the one who says that the reason for the Mishnah's ruling is that the awe of Shabbat is upon the Am Haaretz and he will not lie on Shabbat, it is understandable why we can't rely on his weekday testimony to eat the produce on Shabbat. So basically what this is saying, on weekdays, the Am Haaretz is not necessarily concerned about lying, and their weekday testimony cannot be relied upon according to Rabbi Bivi. But according to the one who says that we give the testimony of the Am Haaretz no credence whatsoever, and the reason that we're permitting the produce is really just for the honor of Shabbat, that's going to be Rabbi Yochanan's opinion, it follows that even if he asks him during the week, he should be permitted to eat the produce on Shabbat. In other words, since the Am Haaretz's testimony is just a pretext to permit eating the produce for the honor of Shabbos, what difference does it make if the testimony was given on Shabbat itself or just a weekday? And that's going to get into really a fine-tuning of where this leniency is allowed. Okay, when are you really allowed to do this leniency? Gemara is going to answer this. The Mishnah says that he may ask the Am Haaretz and eat the produce on the Shabbat on the basis of his testimony only regarding a case where he mistakenly did not tithe the produce before Shabbat. But if he intentionally did not tithe the produce before Shabbat, he's forbidden to rely on the word of the Am Haaretz to eat the food on Shabbat. Why is this, okay? This is a case where you only get this leniency to help you to do Oneg Shabbat in the case that you forgot to tithe it or you were too busy to tithe it and it just slipped your mind and you were just unable to do it. Okay, that's when you get this leniency. But if, it's a Monday and I just bought my basket of pomegranates and I know I'm supposed to separate tithes and I ask the Am Haaretz, did you tithe this? And he says yes. I can't use that testimony and skip tithing for when Shabbat comes and eat these on Shabbat. This is not a leniency where, okay, I've asked him on Yom Rishon and now I can't rely on his tithes during the rest of the week, but I can use this leniency on Shabbat and I don't have to tithe it and I can eat them all on Shabbat. It doesn't work that way. The way this leniency only exists is if you forgot to do the tithe. And even if you ask him on Yom Rishon and now it's going to come to be Shabbat and, are you going to get this leniency, from 6 days earlier? You're not. You don't get this. So the only case that you could get this is if it's literally just before the 2 stars are out in the sky and you found the guy and you asked were these tithed or not. You can rely on that testimony. But really, you have the opportunity to do the tithes. This is not a leniency for you to get a waiver on these pomegranates. So the Gemara continues and says, we learned in our Mishnah, if someone purchases produce from someone who is not trusted regarding tithes, and he forgot to tithe the produce before Shabbat, he may ask the seller, and the purchaser may not rely on his questioning of the Am Haaretz during the week. Why? Because he would have intentionally refrained from tithing the produce before Shabbat. And this Mishnah is really just allowing this leniency only for where there's no other option. And, you didn't deliberately wait until Shabbat, so you don't have to be exempt from tithes, so you don't have to do the tithes. This is a case where you would have tithed it, you just didn't have the opportunity because it slipped your mind. That's where this leniency is. And if, you're playing games with it, then, you don't get this waiver. The Gemara is going to give another limitation to this ruling of the Mishnah. And the Mishnah's leniency pertains only when the purchaser did not have with him a prior stipulation. But if he has with him a prior stipulation, he must eat by tithing on the Shabbat on the basis of a stipulation, and he may not rely on the Am Haaretz's Shabbos testimony. So let's unpack that. The Mara Fulda says, just as we do not allow the purchaser to rely on the seller's testimony once the Shabbos ends, because he is now able to tithe the produce himself, so too when the buyer is able to designate the required tithes on Shabbat through a previous stipulation, he must do so, and he may not rely on the testimony of an unworthy seller. The Mishnah is going to move on, and the Mishnah is going to talk about the next case. It's going to say, if he did not find the seller and someone else who was not trusted regarding tithes says to him that the produce is tithed, he may eat the produce based on his word. Again, why would that be? Well, it looks a lot like Rabbi Yochanan's case. Again, we're going on a pretext. In this case, David was the seller of this basket of pomegranates, and his neighbor Shmuel knows David. You can't just ask a random Amaretz who doesn't know David. You got to ask somebody who knows David's character. And if this guy is testifying that, oh yeah, David does tithe, or he might also say, no, David didn't tithe these, and David doesn't really tithe. He's not so careful with it. Well, you're gonna go on that, because it's gonna be like what the Rosh said. The Rosh was saying that if he's testifying really like what we covered before, like a weak claim that oh no he doesn't do tithes, then you can't rely on that, and you don't get this waiver. So the case goes like this: you can't find the guy who sold it to you, but you find somebody who knows him. And you're asking the other guy, well, is the guy who sold it to me, in this case David, is he trustworthy on tithing these pomegranates? So the Gemara says that one may rely on the testimony given by someone other than the seller himself. And the Gemara is going to be asking whether one may rely on a question put forth by someone other than the buyer himself. And what is the law concerning one's eating on the basis of his fellow's question? So that's a good question. Why is it that you're able to go on this second guy's testimony? And again, it looks like Rabbi Yochanan's point. This is really just a pretext for you to have oneg Shabbat, and they're being very careful not to uproot the institution and the awe and the respect of doing tithes at all. The Gemara is going to explain this, and it's going to say, what is this case? And this is going to be where two people purchase produce from the Amaretz at the same time, and one of them asked him on Shabbat whether the produce he bought was tithe, and this person is going to answer the first buyer in the affirmative. He's going to say yes. Question that really comes up is, can the purchaser of the second basket of produce assume that his basket is also going to be tithed or not? And, okay, so person one and person two go and they buy pomegranates, a basket of pomegranates from David. And person one asks David, and even if person two hears the testimony and says, oh, David, Shabbat, were my pomegranates tithed? And David says yes. Now, question is, can the second person who even heard rely that his basket's tithed? Does he have to ask David too? The answer is going to be coming up, yeah, he does have to ask. And no, he can't rely on the first person's testimony. Why would that be? Well, David is an Amaretz. Maybe he tithed just the produce of baskets that he gave to the first person. And maybe he forgot to do the tithes on the second basket. And if you just relied on that, well, maybe you would be eating something that you shouldn't be eating. Another case, what happens if person one bought dates and I bought a basket of pomegranates? Well, maybe David definitely tithed the dates, but maybe he didn't get around to tithing the pomegranates at all. Or maybe he did a partial tithe of it. Well, that's important to know. So you can't rely on it, because you're dealing with somebody who the character of the Amaretz is already unreliable on the tithes. And if you were to say, like a Haver, like, oh, well, I know the Haver is going to be trusted on tithes and he's going to be doing it accordingly. And, if, I bought from the Haver a basket of pomegranates and person number 2 bought a basket of pomegranates, and you heard the testimony of the first person, the second person can trust the testimony because the chaver is trusted on tithes. But the nature of the am haaretz is not trusted on tithes. So you don't know, you can't be sure that that second basket was tithed. You have to ask as well. The Gemara is going to answer this, and it's going to say the same thing. It's going to say that the second person, cannot eat until he tithes the produce or until he asks the seller himself whether the produce that he purchased was also tithed. So without this further verification, the Gemara says that, it would say that although he tithed the produce of one buyer, perhaps he did not tithe the produce of the other buyer. In other words, this leniency, you don't get this leniency for the second person with the second basket of produce because maybe he didn't tithe it. And you would basically have to wait until after Shabbat to do the tithes, and you don't get this waiver, you don't get this rabbinic leniency. The Gemara is going to add to it, and it's going to say, furthermore, even if one person bought from the am haaretz 2 baskets of produce at the same time, now there's not even 2 people, there's one person who bought 2 baskets. And the Gemara continues and says, and he asked him on the Shabbat about one of them, and he said that it was tithed. The Gemara says he may not eat the second basket until he tithes it, or he asks the seller whether it was tithed too. And without this other verification, the Gemara basically would say the same thing. It would say, I say that, although he tithed this first basket, he did not tithe the second basket. So you can't rely on the am haaretz testifying on the first basket because, maybe the first basket was tithed, maybe the second basket's not. You have to either ask on each of the baskets individually, or if you can't do that and you can't find them, you got to wait till Shabbat ends, you got to ask, and you got to go do the tithes. Gemara continues and says, with the onset of darkness at the departure of Shabbat, at which point it becomes forbidden to eat even the basket about which he asked the seller about the tithes, he may tithe from this basket upon that basket. So what that is since Shabbat ends, and now, by the way, if it's like Rabbi Yochanan and this waiver that you had expired, so now basically what this is saying is both baskets are going to be Demai, and you have to tithe both baskets. You lose this waiver. And the idea here is that he may separate the tithes from the Demai produce of one of the baskets on behalf of the Demai produce on the other basket. What this is trying to teach is that the testimony on the first basket gives you no special anything after Shabbat ends. This is treated just like any regular basket of Demai. That's what this is trying to say. If the case of a haver, and the haver gave you testimony that this one is definitely tithed and the second basket is going to be Demai, you would not be able to do tithes on this basket on behalf of that basket. You wouldn't be allowed to do that in the halacha. And what this is trying to reinforce is that the testimony of the am haaretz doesn't make it like the case of the haver. It's really saying that the testimony of the am haaretz is worthless, and you're going to be able to go and tithe this basket on behalf of that basket. You don't get any special upgrade from this testimony on Shabbat. That's what this is trying to drill in. The Gemara wants to analyze this, and it's going to get into a question that remains unanswered. And the Chazan Ish, by the way, is going to give a possible resolution to this problem. We'll look at that in a second. So the Gemara is going to go like this. According to the one who says that it is on account of the honor of Shabbos, that's going to be Rabbi Yochanan, then the Mishnah permits the Demai produce on the basis of the am haaretz's testimony, and it's going to be understandable that one may tithe from one basket on behalf of the other basket. So why would that be? Okay, Shabbat ended, and very nice that you gave testimony during Shabbat. Very nice that there's a rabbinic leniency so you can have oneg Shabbos, But now that Shabbos ended, this Am Haaretz testimony goes back to being worthless. And now this basket of Demai and that basket of Demai has no greater weight in testimony from the other. So it goes back to the halacha that you can tithe on this basket on behalf of that basket, and there's no problem whatsoever. The Gemara says, but according to the one who says that our Mishnah permits eating Demai on the basis of the Am Haaretz's Shabbos testimony because of the awe of Shabbat is on him and he's going to say the truth, then the question is, how can the buyer tithe from upon the other basket? In other words, if you're going to say it's like Rabbi Bivi, you're going to say that the Am Haaretz is going to give you some sort of special testimony and we can rely on the credibility of Shabbat to give a more accurate testimony, then how can you say that Shabbat ends and now you're going to be able to tithe for this one on behalf of that one? So in other words, why is it that one, which the Am Haaretz is going to be testifying, is going to be considered tithe, and the other one that he does not testify on is still going to be considered Demai, and one cannot tithe produce already tithed upon Demai, and vice versa? And really what this is trying to ask is, it's going to say like, well, let's just look at the Chazan Ish about this. And the Gemara is teaching that although we allow the purchaser to rely on the seller's Shabbos testimony to eat the produce on Shabbat, when Shabbat ends, it's not enough to separate the tithes for the food that remains. And again, we're trying to analyze Rabbi Bivi's point that what happens now when Shabbos ends, if you're going to give extra credence to the testimony of the Am Haaretz on one of these baskets, then perhaps you shouldn't be able to tithe for this basket on that basket because maybe his testimony has extra weight, right? Chazan Ish says that he must separate as well for the food that he already ate on Shabbat. And although one cannot retroactively tithe eaten produce, the rabbis are requiring tithes to be separated for the produce that was eaten on the Shabbos in lieu of tithes that could not be separated on Shabbat. And that's how the Chazan Ish is going to explain Rabbi Bivi's point. But I think one of the other things to keep in mind is that even by Rabbi Bivi, that this Am Haaretz has awe for Shabbat, and he may be very well-intentioned, but he's still an Am Haaretz. He's still not learned enough to be careful with how all the tithes work. So now in a time when you can definitely do tithes, really even by Rabbi Bivi, it should be that you can separate tithes for this basket on behalf of that basket. Why would that be? Because, okay, very good that he has awe, very good that he wants to give extra, credence and he's not going to lie, but anyway, the testimony is kind of faulty because he's not really good at separating tithes anyway. So he might be accurate in being truthful, but he's being truthful about something that he's really not that knowledgeable about. And so that's why now, given the chance to tithe, you would go ahead and tithe. The Gemara is going to ask another question. And it's going to say, until now, we know that our Mishnah allows someone to rely on the Shabbos testimony of the Am Haaretz when he does not have any tithe produce of that species to eat. But would it allow, in other words, would this rabbinic leniency allow relying on his testimony even when he does have tithe produce of that species available? What is this asking? I'd like to look at the Vilna Goan for an explanation of this. And basically what this is saying is that the purchaser has the produce that he's already tithed, and that's going to be besides the Demai produce that was bought from the Am Haaretz. And the question that's coming and is being asked in this Gemara is, does the Mishnah allow him to rely on the Am Haaretz's Shabbos testimony even for the luxury of eating the produce of his choice? Or perhaps is the Mishnah being lenient and limiting it to one who would otherwise be deprived of eating produce altogether? And so what we're seeing is, following this logic, it would seem like even on Shabbat itself, if the buyer owns tithe produce of the same species, it would look like there's no grounds to allow him to rely on the testimony of the Am Haaretz, because he can partake of the same type of produce in a totally permissible manner. But perhaps what this is trying to teach is that this guy would wish to partake of this other produce on Shabbat, and in this case, are we going to rely on the Am Haaretz's testimony, regardless of whether he has permitted produce in the house? In other words, let's say like this, okay? I have a permitted basket of pomegranates, and I bought from David, the Am Haaretz, who, by the way, is not really an Am Haaretz. He's a great Torah scholar, a great rabbi. He's sitting with me here in the yeshiva listening to the shiur, but I'm just using it as an example. Let's say David here, the Am Haaretz, or another David, right, sells another basket, okay? And I have a basket that's definitely tithe. I bought it from a haver. It's pomegranates. And now I have in my house this other basket of pomegranates in the house. It's Shabbat. And David's pomegranates look really, really good. And the pomegranates I got from the haver, all kosher food is good, but these are not as good, right? Now, it's Shabbat, and I really want to own Shabbat, right? They're asking, do you get this leniency now in this case because you already have definitely tithe produce in front of you, and it's very nice that you want to eat, and you're craving, David's, beautiful pomegranates that, really are going to be Demai. Do you get this waiver or not? In other words, if you go and you find David and you ask him on Shabbat, was his tithe, are you going to be able to eat these better looking, better quality pomegranates versus the definitely tithe produce that you already have in your house? You could argue that, you should not get this leniency because you have something that is the same. It's already definitely tithe. Should be that you go with that. Or perhaps you could argue that, it's only Shabbat and, your heart craves this on Shabbat and you should be allowed to do it. So here's what the Gemara answers. It says, since his inner desire craves the untithed produce as well, in this case, these better looking pomegranates, he may rely on the testimony of the Am Haaretz even when he has the other tithe produce of the same species there. And that is a really big chiddush. And tomorrow, we're going to be getting into how do you ask the Am Haaretz in a tactful way whether this is tithe. That's going to be a trick and an art. We're going to learn some of the stories about this from Rabbi Yonah, who was after Rabbi Zera and was one of the heads of the academy in Eretz Yisrael. And we're also going to get what happens with Yom Tov and Shabbat when they come together. Studying laws in detail, even if they're complicated and knotty and difficult and challenging, gives you special merit in Shemayim. Have a great day.